and you see that person and you see like that like life, and you think that like, oh, well, I could, if I look like that, then maybe like if I'm wearing that, then maybe my life will kind of be like that. Welcome to the Team Look to Fit Roundtable. I'm your host, Laurin. Each week we share the evidence-based practices and communication-driven strategies we use with our clients to give you the tools that you need to be successful for life. This week I'm joined by Rick, our mental health counselor, and we're going to answer a question that was sent in about breaking a shopping addiction. And we're going to talk a little bit about addiction in general, but we're really going to focus on answering this specific question. So I'm going to read it so you guys have a little bit more background. And I think that there's parts of this that are very specific, but there are definitely key takeaways that everybody can have from this. And it's probably dealt with in some capacity.
Yeah.
So I have a shopping addiction coupled with not being taught how to manage money growing up. Recipe for debt and money managing disaster. I feel that Instagram and influencers make this worse because you feel like you have to have certain things because of that influence. I want to learn how to manage my shopping addiction and money. Growing up, I wasn't taught about credit, collections, debt, the real things that you teach you in high school. My dad was a single dad who did everything he could to keep us afloat, but my senior year, we lost our house and he lost his car, and I'm afraid to turn into that eventually. I'm also in a pretty intensive school program, and I feel that I might use my phone, shopping, social media, etc. as a distraction. What are some ways to learn to stop impulse buying and constantly buying things, shopping, etc.? Or is this just a bad habit? So, like I said, there's a lot of key things here that I think a lot of us can fall into. Like when you want a distraction, it might be easy to use social media or use like, hey, I'm going to buy something to make myself feel better. I think everybody's done that in some capacity, but clearly this sounds more like it's pathologized to something deeper. God, my voice, sorry. I literally just landed from a trip, and it was like 2 days back, 3 days really there, and I spoke all day yesterday, like did not stop speaking basically for 3 days. So I woke up, I was like, damn, this is going to be rough for the podcast. In case my beautiful voice wasn't already great, but one of my clients actually says that she said I have a very soothing voice for her, and I was like, wow, that is the only time I've heard that. So I'm going to hold on to this so tightly. I really appreciate you.
Appreciate that client. The singular client.
Just that. All right, so shopping addiction.
Addiction. First, I want to thank the person who wrote this question because it's a really detailed question, and she provided a lot of insight, and there's a lot of places to kind of take this question. And so, obviously, I always want to preface this. Obviously, one podcast can't cure somebody's issues, but it's a great start. It's a really good starting point, and I think she has much more insight into her own problem than maybe she even realizes. So what is addiction? And we've talked about this in a previous podcast. We've done a two-part series, I think, on addiction. So to kind of recap, traditional thinking and prevailing evidence-based work would indicate that it's a disease, right? The philosophy and approach that how I understand addiction is, yes, if you look at it from that clinical perspective, it's a disease, but really what it is addiction has its origins oftentimes as a response to human suffering, right? No one is necessarily, with the exception of like crack babies, is born an addict. And in fact, and we can even get into this, I don't know if it's appropriate for this podcast or for our next one, but mental health issues overall, the longer I'm in this field, have less to do with genetics and genetic traits that are passed down. Like everybody wants to think like, well, my mother was bipolar, so that makes me bipolar. And the reality is more mental health disorders are less genetic and more the reactions that we have with our environment and how that shapes us, particularly when we're young and our brain is developing. So if we look at addiction, and addiction can be a lot of different things. Addiction can be gambling, it can be sex, it can be the internet, it can be your phone, it can be social media, video games, shopping, food, plastic surgery. There's a lot of different ways that a person's addiction can play out. And so for this particular girl or person, I'm assuming it's a girl, I don't know why I assumed that.
Yeah, me too, but maybe it's not.
Maybe I shouldn't have made that assumption. So if I refer to you as she, maybe that's because primarily most of the women, most of the people that I deal with are female clients. But
well, and I think the numbers show that shopping addictions are definitely more women-based, aren't they? Yeah.
Sure.
And there's certain, like, gaming is often thought of, like, as a male, obviously dominated addiction, but there are certain games that are now, like, tailored to women.
Yeah.
That they have, like, grown exponentially, like, because of, it's like, I don't want to call it like a shopping game, but it's something like that, like a wardrobe game and, like, all this kind of stuff. I'm like, I could see why people would, like, gravitate towards that. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like this is.
I was actually looking to see if there was a
I know,
game
me
at the
too.
bottom, and I was
Shit.
like, no, there's not. I assumed. My bad. I didn't mean to do
But
that.
yes, a lot of our listeners are female. A lot of
Yeah.
our clients are. So that's
Okay. So
that's where our bias is.
I'm not trying to be. I'm not trying to be biased, but if it comes out, I'm still human at the end of the day. And I think I'm going to reference that point one or two times throughout this podcast, which is that addiction is a response to human suffering, and I'm going to do my best to tie this all together in a clinical piece to help that make sense. So what I also want you guys to understand, and what I think is also really relevant for shopping, is that it does include that dopamine dump.
100%.
Yeah.
Even if you're not addicted to shopping, you still are like,
well, like when we think about it, like we get text messages, we get notifications, there's sounds, there's images, like, and all of those things create the same neurological response in our brain that triggers other addictions like gambling or sex or food. Shopping has that same appeal to it, right? Like we get packages sent to our house, like we get excited over that. We act like little kids. You know, like it's Christmas morning and like when we see the Amazon driver pull up. And by the way, if you know your Amazon drivers or your FedEx drivers or your UPS drivers by first name basis, like we might be trending in some dangerous areas here. But like you can get multiple packages a day. There's the tracking, the notifications, the rewards, the building of anticipation as the person comes, waiting, for the routes to be delivered. Like if you know what days and times they're coming, like it can be pretty pathological when you think about it, and it's very easy to dismiss it sometimes, especially when we're talking about shopping, right? People will usually refer to this as like I spend a lot of money, but they don't necessarily look at it in terms of it being unhealthy behavior, or you know what I mean, where it's detrimental, other than just being financially detrimental.
Yeah, because a lot of other addictions are typically affecting other people more directly. This could still affect people directly, of course, like losing a house, being in debt, that could affect your partner or your family.
Right.
But it's typically more you-based, right? And you're not, like, there's nothing that's negative about, like, your health, right? Because, you're still able to maintain all of these things. It's not like if you're an alcoholic or you can't stop smoking cigarettes or whatever, when people think of those things. But it can be just as detrimental, just in a very different way, especially when it gets out of hand. Like growing up, somebody I was very close to, their family literally lost everything because of this. Everything. So maybe a similar situation. I'm not sure all the details about this question. But it was really sad, and I didn't understand when I was growing up, like, what was going on, because you just see, we're always going to the mall, like we're always buying something, like this is fun, because it is fun when you're a kid, and then you get older and you realize like, that was not normal, that wasn't good, and now you can very easily see how that played out, but it was definitely, it can take everything away from you, so it's not to be undermined as something that's less than, just because it's not related to your health or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it can have absolutely detrimental effects on your interpersonal relationships. It can affect your family. It can affect their well-being and your ability to provide for them. Socially, you might not be able to engage in the things that might bring you more meaning and purpose in life, because all of your money is spent on all these things that are filling up your house. From an occupational perspective, like it can cause problems in terms of how you're spending your time at work. Are you prioritizing? Are you still being effective? Where's all of your money being spent? So there's, long-term financial planning. Like if you're spending all of your money now and you're going into huge amounts of debt, like how can you plan for the future? So there's a lot of different ways that it can start to filter in. But yeah, it is very easy to discount like, physically I'm okay. My health is fine. I look fabulous because I have all this great stuff.
And what this person talked about in here was about how influencers make this worse. And I do really want to touch on that because I think that it's this like FOMO situation, right? Like the fear of missing out that people create.
Yes.
And when you hack into people's like the buying psychology of everything, like okay, let's have like these small releases, like we have anticipation, we have all this build up, it's going to drop at this date, this time, get on this list, you have to have this, there's a small amount of quantities, like all of those things get people excited to buy something because you're like, it's not coming back. And like ultimately that's a really good business move. It makes sense as a business owner. But it can be very overwhelming for someone to be like, oh my gosh. And even myself, like, oh, I love that. And then you're like, oh, well, it's going to go, I got to get it because I don't know what they're going to have next time. You know what I mean? And they don't just keep this around. They're not going to restock it. And you just start to see people who like either like or you follow or whatever it is. And it's just so pervasive on social media. And I'm all, I clearly fully support people who do that. I mean, my best friend owned a clothing company for many years and I, supported that and was, showcasing all those things. So like, I totally get it, but it can feel very overwhelming because you're just constantly inundated with that.
Yeah.
And you see that person and you see like that, like life and you think that like, oh, well, I could, if I look like that, then maybe like, if I'm wearing that, then maybe my life will kind of be like that. Even though it won't, you just, cannot tell yourself.
Well, the perception of what you perceive somebody else's life to be versus the reality that it is very different. And we oftentimes compare ourselves to the unrealistic perception instead of the reality. And so I was going to say the realistic reality, but I was like, we don't need to. Yeah. But the idea of it is that you're absolutely right, and I'm gonna touch on that in the part where I start talking about the root cause.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's okay.
I jumped the note.
No, you're good. And so some of the other ways that it can be, where we can see the addiction start to play out is when you're talking about shopping. I think people can spend an excessive amount of time or increasing amounts of time spent shopping even without purchasing, right? They're looking at items, they're constantly searching Amazon, they're combing through different things. And so like when we're talking about being a parent or being involved in a relationship or being engaged at work, like your shopping addiction can be taken away from all those things because your time and energy where it would be better spent in these areas is being drawn into this area, right? It'd be no different than like the person who's addicted to cocaine who's sitting there thinking like, oh God, when am I going to get high again? Where am I going to get it? So they're thinking about those things. You're just looking at Amazon or whatever websites you're going to, and you're like, oh, when's the new drop coming and when's the new bag or the new shoes or whatever. So
it does become this like obsessive thing.
Absolutely.
Because it's just, I guess obsessive is just the best word to think about it because if you're always looking at stuff, then let me just like go on this website and like see what they have. And then you're like, well, let me look again. And then you're like, oh my gosh, I really want that one thing. And then you keep looking, you keep going back to it, or you see things that are similar to it in real life, and then you're like, you can't stop. And then you're just like reeling over it. And you're like, oh my God, this is like a bag or like a pair of shoes. Like, why am I like losing my mind over this?
Something that seems to have little value is consuming so much.
This is $70. Like, why am I so uptight over this? But it becomes this obsessive thing, which is what we see a lot of the obsessive. I would guess a lot of addiction starts with like obsessive behaviors, right? With just anything. Like checking things, like
obsessive compulsive. You have the obsessive part, which is usually the thought process related to the consumption part, right? The like, how am I going to get it? Where am I going to get it? Whether we're talking about cocaine or food or social media, whatever, like it all kind of centers around it. And then the compulsive part are the behaviors that we do to seek those things out. Some of them obviously are much more risky, right? If you're going into somebody's house, if you're going to certain areas, neighborhoods, things like that, like, you're going to put yourself in an inherent risk versus like somebody sitting on their laptop, like ordering stuff. It doesn't seem very risky.
You could lose your job because you're not working.
That's right.
So,
one thing that I do want to say about this particular person who wrote this is that I actually feel like what's great about this client is that he or she is actually, in my opinion, approaching or in what I would consider to be the determination stage of change. There's basically 6 levels of change that I look for in a client in determining like where they are and how I'm going to approach them. The first one is what we would call pre-contemplation, which is basically a person who's in complete denial. Right? They don't want to talk about the problem. They don't have a problem. It's everybody else's issue, not mine. That's pre-contemplation. Contemplation is the second stage of change where a person is basically willing to admit that, like, look, This is a problem. I just don't know. I'm unsure. I don't know if I can change. Okay. Determination is a person who's saying like, look, I have a problem. I'm ready. I'm motivated. I'm willing to change. The next step is actually like action. But in order to get to action, we have to create a plan and really kind of start to figure that stuff out. And so based off of where this person is and the level of insight that they already provided, to me, it indicates like, all right, this is a client who's motivated and ready to work. The who, what, where, when, and why is kind of almost scenery. But I do want to start getting into what potentially might be some of the root causes. And I think what's important is that with these podcasts, sometimes it's not that I want you guys to be your own therapist, but I want you to be able to possess the ability to start asking yourself the right questions and kind of guide yourself through some of this stuff. And so this is what we're going to talk about. Sorry, I didn't mean to kick you. Some of the other stuff, and we're going to talk about social media. So one of the things that she says in her question is she starts talking about some of the other ancillary things that might be the causes for it. And I don't want this for the person who wrote this question for you to take this as me attacking you, okay? Because I'm not. Because there's an important moment where we have to own our part in our own problems. So is marketing and social media and TV and magazines, are they a problem? Yes. Is this her problem? No. Blaming the education system for not teaching her about, credits and debits and managing your money and savings accounts and all that stuff. Is that a problem? Should that be addressed in schools? Yes. Is that her problem? No. Her father didn't teach her about money management and those things. Is that a problem? Yes. Is that her problem? No. What is her problem? She is. We can always look at other things, and they are absolutely triggers, and they feed into the problem. But at the end of the day, in order for us to create any real change, we have to accept the fact that this is a problem within me. It's not a problem with social media. It's not the school systems. It wasn't my dad. This problem is a response that I've created. Okay? And so I want the client that's sitting in front of me, I don't want to say need, but I want that person to really accept and take ownership for what the problem is to say, look, this is me. This isn't these other things that I cannot control. No one makes me pick up my credit card. No one makes me punch into websites. No one makes me order these things except me. Despite how engaging social media can be, despite the marketing ploys and the strategies that businesses are using, you just went into them about the limited drops and all that kind of stuff. There's real strategies to engage us, right? But the real issue in this scenario is her or him, depending on who that is. It isn't the dealers or the parents or the schools. It's us. It's the individual that has the problem. And so by owning that part of it, by taking responsibility, we can then start to denial's completely out of the way. And now that I'm owning the problem, I no longer need to look to place blame somewhere else. I know this is my issue, right? So now I can actually start to work on a plan. But for some people, it's really important to understand why this happened or how this started to develop. So first and foremost, by accepting it and owning it, you no longer have to hide from it, and you can start to free yourself from whatever shame you might be experiencing surrounding it. And to me, this particular individual is braver and more courageous than most other people because they put it out here for the rest of us to kind of dissect. And they're looking for feedback. This person is looking to grow. I keep saying this person. I want to say she so badly. If it slips out, I apologize. If you are a he, don't take it personal. But the first step is obviously taking control and admitting where you are in this process. So to go back to what I was talking about before, this is kind of the why. There was two parts to therapy, right? There's the why things happened. And then the second part is, well, what do I do now with it? And for some people, the why is the most important part. To me, it's the least important part. It's kind of like, what do I do with this information now once I have it? But I get it. It's a big part of the puzzle. So to me, when I start to look at this person's situation, I made the comment to you earlier that addiction is oftentimes the response to human suffering. So what I start to ask myself is, as a therapist, I say, what has happened in this person's life that shopping has now become her response, right? And so what I'm looking at is I'm starting to, as I can pull some of the information from that question, I don't have open dialogue with this person, but Shopping was this person's way of responding to the emotional consequences of her life experiences. Essentially, shopping has become her way or his way of solving a problem. If we look at it from that perspective, it starts to add a little bit more clarity. This is their way of coping. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. Because there had to be a reason, right? And like taking ownership is always going to be the most important thing that you can do, because no matter all the other shitty things that are discussed here, like it's not going to change it. And likely this is only going to get worse if you just keep like blaming it or thinking that that's the reason why you're here. And in reality, you can actually make this change. Like I said, nobody's making you run your credit card. It's not that easy. Like, I'm not saying that it's like easy.
No, it's not.
Like,
it's hard.
It's all me. Okay, thanks so much. Like, appreciate the session. Like, that's not. Like, what if you just said that? You're like, hey, it's you. Like, we're done now. Like, that's it. Just walk out. I mean, it's obviously more complicated than that, but that is a huge first step of recognizing, like, I am in control of this. And all of these things, when we talk about, like, anxiety, especially, and all this, like, all of it's because you think that you can't control a lot of these things, but you really are in control of this, even if there is something physiological going on. Obviously, that becomes a lot more complicated, right? When there are like physiological things happening as well, outside of just like a dopamine rush. Like we're talking about like, you know, withdrawals and things like that. But yeah, that's definitely the first step, and that makes perfect sense.
With addiction, we oftentimes will have two components: the physical addiction that the body has, and then the psychological addiction.
And you, if you have a shopping addiction, you are used to that dopamine rush. So there's no way around it. Like you are using it for that. Yeah. It's the same way that anything else, like gaming, porn, gambling, all the same exact thing.
Yep.
So there's no physical like withdrawal symptoms, but you're expecting that. Response.
The anticipation
and
of it.
And the anticipation is what you actually are craving. Like that's what it is. Yeah. Anyways.
So to even dive a little bit further into the why or the root cause for this person, these are some things that I would start to look at. She wrote about her father a lot in there, but what we also didn't hear is about her relationship with her mother. All right. So there's no mother. So that would be something that I would also want to focus on. Single dad, right? People choose their words very carefully sometimes, and it's not by accident that things are left in or out. So I always try and pay attention to specific verbiage sometimes. But she also wrote about how their family struggled financially. And she experienced what I would consider to be more or less extreme poverty when they lost their home, they lost their car. So I have this thing that I try and explain to people, and it's a difficult concept for people to grasp, not understand, but adopt as like truth. And sometimes we get into relationships or things happen, and because the relationship or the experience succeeded, the relationship ultimately ends up failing because it worked. And so what I mean by that is sometimes when we get somebody who will love us or will make us a priority, or somebody who will financially provide for us, like it somehow cathartically cures what was missing in our life earlier. And so now we no longer need this person or that relationship because it actually resolved itself. And so it's really weird that this healthy person or this relationship that worked to cure that is no longer what I need in my life. And so sometimes relationships can fail because they actually succeeded. And it's hard for people to accept that as a truth, but it does, and it happens. So some of the things that I'm thinking about when I'm listening to this particular person talk about it is, do they feel the need to lose everything again, to confront that space within them that happened when they were 15 or 16? Is this person trying to sabotage their life in an effort to replay or re-victimize themselves? Is this person attempting to jeopardize themselves to such a degree so that they can work themselves out of a situation that they had no control over when they were younger? So like if I can create the same scenario where I'm homeless and now I can work myself out of it, is she just simply replaying the pathology of her childhood? Or is she working to create some level of control and autonomy in a situation that she clearly had none? Most people who are living with their dad, you know, I'm assuming this was around high school age. I don't remember if there's something in there that indicated that.
No, but
generally when we're living with our parents. Oh, yeah,
but my senior year.
My senior year, okay. She could have been talking, or he could have been talking about college, but either way. So, you know, also, is this person subconsciously recreating their childhood to change the outcome?
Do you see that a lot?
Yes, because we play out, sometimes we can stay stuck emotionally in a space and we play that out until we can resolve the issues of what happened earlier in our life. And when I say resolve, I think sometimes people have this thing like where they can create a therapeutic environment, rework the entire experience, and then suddenly they're okay. And that can happen under certain circumstances. But the reality is what most people work to try and do is to create the awareness in yourself when things are triggering you, to be able to be like, okay, number one, I'm aware of the fact that I'm angry or I'm anxious or I'm feeling something. Who gives a shit what it is? I know that I'm feeling it and it doesn't feel good. Where is this coming from? Well, this is coming from my past. This is old stuff. Okay, if it's old stuff, what do I need to do now? What do I need? What are my needs in this moment? How do I self-soothe? How do I create healthier responses to this problem instead of smoking, drinking, snorting, hitting the online cart? You know what I mean?
The online cart.
It just reminded me of something somebody sent me this week. It was like a meme. It was like, I know, sorry, because it just occurred to me. The meme was something like,
You have to share it.
I do.
Okay. You can't just stop mid-podcast.
The meme was therapist. And how does this, and what do we do when this happens in our life? And then the response was me. Click, add to cart. Therapist. No. So, sorry. That just jumped into my head randomly. Sorry, we all have ADHD moments.
I have plenty, everybody knows this. But I love those types of memes.
I do too.
The meme.
Where was it?
So, no, but I said, is that something that happens a lot? And that makes a lot of sense that,
Yeah.
and I guess that kind of goes back to the, like, self-sabotage, sort of, right?
It can.
And some people I know some people argue that that's not really a thing, right? There's some people in the field who say...
This next part may answer the self-sabotage part.
Some people say that it's maybe not self-sabotage, maybe you just think that you want to do that, but you don't anymore, right? So that is one theory or way of looking at it. But obviously there's another way of looking at it. Like if there's a lot of like whatever you want to call trauma that happened, maybe you're like reverting back to that. So I think it probably always depends.
I mean, one of the other things that I had written down was, is she too familiar with the sense of struggle? Is this an attempt for her to continue to struggle? Sometimes we fear success more than we do failure, especially when failure and struggling are more familiar to us.
I see that all the time.
Yes, we see that a lot. We see that play out a lot in relationships with people. They move from one bad relationship to the next, or they move from one subpar relationship to the next, or they just never allow themselves the ability to grow, because what's familiar to us is familiar and at least consistent. And so it kind of becomes the devil we don't know, right, is scarier than the one we do. And so we stick with what we know. And so sometimes, and I don't know, this is me without open dialogue with somebody, just saying like, okay, this is where my mind is going, and this is how I'm conceptualizing this person. I'm hearing a lot about dad and their financial struggles. And so I keep thinking to myself, is this person trying to recreate or attach themselves back to this space and time that was so scary, so awful for them, that they disconnected from it, right? Because what happens with people when we're placed in stressful situations is we've talked about, the fight, flight, or freeze response. But when we don't have control or the ability to do anything in a situation, right? Like if I start just hurling insults at you, you have a couple of basic responses. Yeah. You can get up and walk away, right? So that's essentially flight. You're avoiding the situation, you're leaving it. Option 2 would be for you to argue back and be like, Rick, you're rude, you're a jerk, whatever, which is exactly what would happen. But let's say you don't do that, or you can't do that. Well, what other options are left? The only other option, because it's just the two of us in this room, our studio audience isn't here today.
Next week.
Yeah. The only other option that you have is if you can't do anything, if none of those other options are available to you, what happens? How do you deal with it? Well, the answer to that is you don't deal with it. Your brain does. And how does your brain deal with it? It shuts down. It dissociates, it disconnects from whatever is causing that stress. And it's this way of coping, okay? So this coping mechanism is derived and it originates from a space to keep you safe. However, that ultimately becomes a pattern in our life that we use to keep us safe. But then we get to this space where we no longer need that coping mechanism, but unfortunately it's now become a trait in our personality. And so now what was helping us is now hurting us. And so this is the origin of psychopathology, right? Where you're starting to see like, well, why are these negative things? This is now affecting me. And so is it a result of the poverty and the lack of control and seeing her family struggle and her struggle that maybe caused her to kind of like shut down, or him shut down? And now they're replaying this? Time will tell. Having a more in-depth conversation with that person would help me guide whether or not where this is actually coming from and what the real why is. But that's just some of the stuff that came to my mind when I was thinking about them. And so ultimately what I want this person to understand is that shopping is this person's response to stress, to anxiety, to their deeper rooted feelings of insecurity or inadequacy. And I don't mean insecurity within them as a person, but the insecurity of themselves within the world. Like, think about like having your house ripped away from you and being like, where am I going to go? Right? And this is like, for us as adults with friends and means, we're like, okay, I can go check myself into a hotel. It's very easy for me to go rent something. Well, what do you do when you're 15 or 16 or 17 and you have a job where you're like making money for fast food and for clothes? Like, you can't afford rent. Like, so it's this threat to her survival or his survival. And so that experience can also be tied to their, can be very traumatic for a person. So when we say early childhood trauma, it doesn't necessarily mean things that happened when you were like 2, 3, 4, or 5. It can be up through a space where you had and don't have the ability to control it. Does that make some sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I do want to touch on a few maybe practical things too, though, that like right away, like, so obviously they mentioned, Instagram, using the phone, social media, all of that, like creating this desire.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you need to take that honest assessment of like, all right, really audit yourself as far as like what are creating these issues. Like when, like every time you open Instagram and you see X person, right? Like every time you see Rick's profile and he has this great new outfit,
yes,
that's totally what's happening.
Absolutely.
His try on haul. But no, seriously, okay, let's say we'll take anybody else.
I'll be doing geese, you guys. I don't do anything else other than jiu-jitsu clothing. So.
It's like tying belts. Okay. So
Origin, contact me, please.
We're like, can we finally get a sponsor?
Hayabusa, Fuji. Any of you guys, show your role. Come on.
Okay.
I'm open. Here.
We're like, really, anything. Okay. So say you see a certain person,
mm-hmm.
right? And you're like, every time, Kim Kardashian, we'll just use this as an example. Every time you see her life, you see her page,
mm-hmm.
you're like, wow, I'm awestruck with her beauty, with her style, her fashion, her house, her life. Maybe like just mute her profile, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because every time you see that, it somehow has now become a trigger for you to go, not just, oh, let me look at Kim's picture or profile and like,
mm-hmm.
this is cool. Like, it's not enough to be like, oh, I like her style or like her house. To then that triggers you to like go into a negative space or to go buy something.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you need to be really honest with yourself. All right, I need to maybe mute these people and follow these people, just kind of remove it from my periphery. Another thing too is to just audit yourself on when these things are happening.
Mm-hmm.
Is it because, were you really stressed out? Because she said she's in a like intensive school program, or
mm-hmm.
he or she said they're in an intensive school program. So I really hope this person reaches out and lets us know, because I just want now I just really want to know more than anything. Just so I can
just don't include your name. Just say he or she. That's it.
Just send a message like
I'm a he. I'm a she.
He or she. So you're in this intensive school program, right? Is it on days where you haven't like gone outside and like gone for a walk, or you haven't exercised, or you haven't done something like for yourself to like relieve stress, so you're really, really like frazzled, and then you're like, oh, and you see something, then that's when you buy it, right?
Sure.
Or is it when, like, whatever it is. So you have to really audit yourself on like, when are these things happening? Why are they happening? And sometimes it's I'm not saying that it's as easy as that. Like, there's a lot more to it, like mm-hmm. Rick already talked about. But those are some immediate things that you can do to remove yourself from at least having that so easily accessible, because you can't get rid of your phone, you can't get rid of the internet. You need a credit card. So those things aren't going to go away, which make them really challenging. That's why people really struggle with food addiction. I mean, one of the many reasons. But
mm-hmm.
like if you have, maybe like an illegal drug addiction, they're generally harder to come across, right? Not always, but generally speaking, they are. Versus your cell phone or food, you have to eat every day.
Yep.
You have to eat several times a day, ideally, hopefully, healthfully. So like, it's really hard that every time you see food or you have to eat, you have to make that decision. So at the same time, every time you pick up your phone, like you can't get rid of that. So you have to make some type of decision. All right, how am I going to audit my like mindset around this? So those would be two things that I would do like immediately that would be really hopefully actionable. And then of course, budgeting, but
well,
we'll get to that.
So just a couple of things, what we want to do from a more practical perspective as well. And you're absolutely right with, you want to pay attention to things that are going to trigger you, the situations and circumstances that are in your life that are going to create or add more stress, where you're likely to want to cope with it in that way. Without that awareness, you're kind of like throwing darts in the dark here. So there's some things to consider. Number one, we want to create a space where we can stop obsessing over the things and adopt more of a mindful awareness of what we actually need in our life versus what we actually want. Okay? So how do we start to do that? Well, what is the purpose and the meaning behind her making this change and not spending is one of the first questions I would ask. So she wants to, or he or she is saying, this is a bad habit and I want to change that. Okay. What's the meaning behind that? What's the purpose of this change for you? Because what I want is, I want this message to be internalized and I want it to be reflected in their spending habits. Okay. So whatever the purpose behind this is, I want that purpose to be seen in how we're going to be spending our money. Because this, to me, shopping addiction is very similar to like a sex addiction, right? And where sex and shopping are different from like traditional addictions, like I can make the argument that you don't need alcohol, right? You don't need it to survive.
Okay. I feel personally.
But you can cut it out of your life. You can cut weed and cocaine and a lot of other things completely out of your life. You don't need them. But human beings require sex. Human beings are going to have to purchase things from time to time. So we can't just say, let's just stop this and block it out of our life forever. No, you're going to have to learn how to manage it in healthy ways. So I would want that to be reflected in the spending habits. And I also would start to ask this person, like, what do you value most in life? And are your actions moving in the direction of your values, right? Is the spending moving in the direction of where you see the perception of your life and what value and worth it has? Is this enhancing that or is it taking it away from it? Okay. Are you looking to collect things or experiences, right? So this is moving more away from like the tangible things like glass and clothes and things to like what are more experiences that I can create, vacations,
which
movies,
do cost
books.
money as well.
It does.
It's different.
It is, and we'll get to that. And
the money you save from shopping, you could spend on your trip.
Exactly. How do you want your time and money to serve you? Is a better question to ask people. To serve you.
Oh, I heard that as one word, and I was like, "This is a new one."
Okay.
Serve you.
To serve you. All right. Another good question to ask yourself if you're considering, you don't know whether or not what you're about to buy is something that you need, want, or is a part of this, ask yourself this question. If I was on a secluded island all by myself, would I still need this? Ask yourself that question. I know, what you guys can't see if you're listening to this is the fact that Lauren's eyes rolled into the back of her head. Like, oh my God, Rick, that was so dumb. Okay. The reason for that is
I get it.
We're trying to determine whether or not that this is an internal motivating factor or an external motivating factor behind the decision. I know you get it. But no one else can see your eye rolls. Only I have that wonderful pleasure.
Distinct pleasure.
So the idea of being able to identify whether or not something is internal versus an external. External would be, you saw Kim Kardashian have it, now I want it. Internal would be, well, this is going to help me to do this, or it's going to enhance this, or it's going to bring about that. So there's a different perspective with
like
it.
a purposeful buy,
Yes.
like a new laptop.
Yeah.
You probably need that if you're in an intensive school program. So maybe like that's something that, maybe you don't need like the most expensive one, but you're probably going to need a laptop at some point or whatever it might be versus, this new bag or boots.
Yes. So here's a couple more practical tips to kind of help people who are struggling with this. Number one, have a budget, create one. a true cost of living, you can identify your value system that way, and it'll allow some shopping, but within limits. So we need a true cost of living. Number 2, start paying in cash. There's plenty of research out there that indicates when you spend with cash, you see how much money you're spending, and it creates a reflex in you where you're like, I don't want to spend any more money. But when we don't see the money, when it's just debit and credit cards, debit is better than credit because it's pulling actual money. So what you can do is, I've seen some people will set up separate accounts and they'll put like $300 in that account. And it's like, okay, this is your money for the month to spend. And all of a sudden they go and buy something and they're like, well, I have $4 left. I can't buy anything. And that's the supervision we need to provide ourselves sometimes. But paying in cash, you can see it and you get a better understanding of what you're spending your money on.
I wonder how much worse things have gotten because of online shopping. Like, I feel like that's
substantially.
Like, I would love to see numbers on that, which, I mean, I don't know if it's even possible, but just like people's spending habits with online shopping is just probably vastly different.
Well, places like Amazon make it ridiculously easy to buy things.
Yeah.
I mean, you can get it like I'm pissed that it's not here like even faster. I don't care.
Oh my God.
I don't care that I can get next day delivery.
I literally go out of my way to like go to stores.
I do too. I like to feel things before I buy them.
Yeah, and like you're helping people who work there, all these things, and like talking to people because I'm weird. But like that whole like experience, I feel like I don't know why people would rather do online stuff. I'd go out of my way to do things in person, like on purpose.
Yeah.
But I mean, of course, but I guess you could say it's less convenient, but it's like, how many things are you buying that you really need like, right that second? Like you probably, the vast majority of things, like we don't.
Yeah. So yeah, number 3, I would tell you to seek professional help too. CBT, getting into groups, opening up with your problem to your family and friends. Why do I say that? Because the more people that know about it, the deeper levels of accountability, and it eliminates the shame, because shame comes from when we try and keep things too secret because we're ashamed of it and we don't want anybody to know, and it's this deep dark secret and it's this thing we hate about ourselves. But if we can start to own it and accept it, it no longer has the control over us to operate in these deep dark devious ways. I would also tell you, start looking to replace the habit with something that's a little healthier. This is where you might need to restrict yourself. This is kind of what we were talking about. If like you like to spend some of your free time scrolling through Instagram, like maybe you should look at the people who trigger you and block them. Like you don't need to follow the Kardashians. You don't need to follow certain people, especially if all they are influencers that are really pushing like products. Like you might have to restrict yourself. Like people who have sex addictions, they have to like put blocks on their computers for porn and for all kinds of stuff.
Site blocks, and I don't know again like the names of these things, but sure, a quick Google search could find it. And like if you find yourself, especially going to like a certain website, right? Like, and I don't know the specifics here, but if it's like always this one website when something drops, maybe you just for the time being like have that blocked. Maybe if it is Amazon, like yeah, I get it, it's convenient, but like fucking drive down the road and get something. Like take away your Prime, block that website. Like you don't need something that quick. Like you can make time in your schedule to go to the store.
You're not going to die without it.
No. Like
Publix is down the street if you need food.
Nobody really needs it, but it's so funny. Like when I go to all these places like out of town, and I was like, Publix is the best. Like there's no grocery store that beats Publix in my opinion. And it's so funny with people who have traveled like more south. They're like, oh, you have Publix. And I'm like, it's like a whole thing. Like, oh, you live in Florida, there's Publix, right? Yep. And like it's like this. It's so funny. And I'm like, yeah, we're superior. Publix is a superior grocery store. But yeah, so go down the road. Maybe if it is like something like it is in Amazon, just because it's so easy, or any website like that that's so easy access. Limit it, block it on whatever website.
Block the social media, unfollow people who are likely to trigger you. Find ways to spend your time connecting with people to help fight boredom and loneliness rather than looking for our phones or the internet to soothe that part of us. Shop more consciously. What I mean by that is make a list and get only what's on your list. Shopping more consciously can also be like, okay, instead of giving into certain things, like maybe research it, understand exactly what it is that you're purchasing, like become a pickier shopper so that you're not just purchasing everything. So again, sometimes it can be more about quality over quantity. You will actually appreciate things a little bit more when they're a higher quality.
100%. And if it is something that is expensive, one thing that I always try to use for myself at least is to say, okay, if I want something and I really think that I want it, I'm going to sit on it, right? Again, I understand certain things are going to go away, but that laptop or that, let's say, nothing functional, a purse, you want it right now, okay? Like I could go into any store and buy 100 things just because, I like this, I like that, I like that. But I might forget about them. It might be in my drawer. But okay, I really want this expensive thing. I'm going to think about this for months now. And then if I still want it or I still see it and I still desire it and I've saved money for it or I can do that, that's a better time to buy it instead of like super impulsively, especially if it's really expensive. And, I understand, like, don't know what this person's situation is like with their funds and all that. But, even if you are incredibly well off,
right.
If you have poor spending habits, you are no longer going to be well off.
Yeah.
And the richest people spend less than 10% of what they make, like literally. So if you have this terrible money mindset, doesn't matter how much money you have, you're going to either blow it all if you're like be a multimillionaire and you can blow all your money because you don't know how to save, budget, not impulsively buy. So really, if you see things that you want, and again, I understand part of this is like the FOMO and I got to get it now. But there's always going to be a new pair of leggings. You know what I mean? Might not be exactly the same way. But for that, if you are really struggling here, like you have to put some restraints on yourself.
Yeah. I would also tell you to get a spending journal. And I know this might be something that's difficult for people, but when you track and catalog how much you're spending, you can't ignore the actual cost of things. And what we also tend to do sometimes is we will rationalize things in a way where it can mean the exact same thing, but the way we phrase it, it sounds worse than the other. And so in our minds, when we're trying to shop, we're going to say, it's only a couple of bucks, right? And so, but it's not really a couple of bucks. It's more expensive than that. Like I equate it to this, when somebody is like trying to make an argument over time, for example, I'll say something like, oh my God, that's going to take it's like a quarter of an hour, right? I'm only talking about 15 minutes. A quarter hour, you never heard that?
Of course I've heard of that,
Okay.
but why would you choose to say that?
Because I want you to be thinking about it in terms of, you're thinking about an hour versus if I were to say, it's only 15 minutes, right? So you hear 15 minutes and suddenly 15 minutes sounds shorter than a quarter of an hour because in your mind you hear hour and you're somehow associating it with a longer length of time, even though it's still 15 minutes. But you rationalize it in that really weird way. So when you want somebody to do something quickly, you're like, it's only 15 minutes away. And if you're like reluctant to want to do this trip, you're like, that's a quarter of an hour. Like, I don't want to do that. And so suddenly it just seems different and it sounds different and the perception of it is different. But keep a spending journal. It'll help you kind of track where your money's going and how much you're actually spending on stuff. And sometimes that can kind of create like that, oh shit, like I've spent a lot of money and I don't need to spend anymore. So it just helps keeps the perspective and the true cost of what things are instead of like our weird ways of thinking about things. And then the last two things would be, number one, set powerful and kind of meaningful financial goals for yourself beyond just spending. Look to say, I'm going to get out of debt by a certain date, or I want to save this amount of money by a certain date, or have this much passive income by a date, right? You refocus your energy and your energy will go to wherever you're directing it to. So if your energy is like being spent on spending, that's where it's going to be. If you're focusing your energy on how do I save, that's where your energy is going to be spent. And it's really great to watch your savings grow and your investing grow. There's more meaning and it's more fulfilling when it is those things. And then the last thing would be like, if you don't have a strong understanding of credits and balances and creating budgets and things, look up any junior college in your area and see if there's a basic intro to finance class. Talk to some friends and say, hey, who's really good at saving their money? Who's great at budgeting? Who's good at doing some of these things? And go talk to them. Like I have people all the time. I've given away more free therapy than I've billed for from friends and family who are just like, hey, what about this and what about that? And I'm sure you've given away countless hours of coaching and tips for people because you're just a generous person and it's what you do. So, but take a class. There's nothing wrong with paying a couple $100.
This is a good investment.
To save money and thousands of dollars and potential relationships and issues later. So I hope this helps this client.
Yeah, and this is not to say that you can never spend money again.
No, quite the opposite.
Yeah, and there might be things in your life that you want to spend money on that maybe people don't understand, right? Maybe therapy, right? Maybe you're like, man, maybe I really do need to go to therapy. But the people in your life are like, no, that's stupid. Like, therapists don't know anything. They're just telling you what you want to hear. Whatever, right? Like, so somebody might not get it as like an example. Oh, you hired a nutrition coach? Like, that's so stupid. Or whatever it might be, right? Mm-hmm. So there's certain things that are going to be an investment that we're not saying like you need to just completely cut all ties and just save all of your money. But clearly it sounds like there is irresponsible spending for just material goods that are happening. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, even if it's not like hits, purchase, the obsessive thoughts over this are likely creating a lot of stress and a lot of, I'm not worth anything. I'm not as good as these other people because I don't have that. Like, it's creating a whole downstream effect.
For this person, it also creates a cycle.
Yeah.
She's stressed, or this person is stressed, right? And they're feeling anxious. And that anxiety is tied to experiences that happened that were very impactful in this person's life. So that stress is kind of embedded. It's more or less generalized. So what do they do to soothe that? They shop. But what's the end result of shopping? More stress, more anxiety. Yeah. So what do I need to do? Shop some more. And so it creates this loop where like, all right, if I'm not addressing these things, I stay stuck in the same cycle. And so that's kind of the, however people want to spend their money, they can spend it. I don't care. It's just, is it being put in the right places at the right time and with the right purpose behind it? And hopefully this helps this person gain a little bit of insight and maybe even take the next step into contacting a therapist. If you are going to see somebody, whoever this person is, I would recommend you find somebody. This is more of a CBT because this is more cognitive and behavioral. This isn't like some sort of existential crisis or anything like that. So find somebody who's maybe pretty proficient in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And again, get yourself involved in maybe some groups. I'm sure you can find out, there's probably online some things that are happening around you, addiction or spending groups, things like that.
You're certainly not the only person dealing with
this. Oh, God, no.
So
no.
There has to be resources around. So this was a really great question. Mm-hmm. I, again, thank you for sending this. And if you guys have any other questions that you're interested in sending for us to discussed on the podcast, I will leave that link below. I will also put Rick's contact information below as well. And if you enjoyed the show, please share it. We're on YouTube, Spotify, and iTunes, and we really, really appreciate it. So thank you guys, as always, for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.